Here's King George III saying, I have 13 problems, and they're all the U.S. colonies. We spent last week looking at a whole bunch of different events that are leading the American colonies closer and closer to war with the British. We're going to want our independence. After the French and Indian War, we felt like the British started a whole bunch of policies that just weren't very fair to the Americans. Things like the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act really irritates us. The Townsend Acts and other things like this. Some Americans do little funny pranks to the British, right? Tarring and feathering and little stuff like that. Well, the British don't take them as very little. A lot of problems between the Americans and the British. We did the Boston Massacre story where tensions boil over into violence in Boston. 5 Boston residents are killed by British soldiers. We often consider them the first deaths of the American Revolution, even though the war doesn't actually start till about 5 years later. We also spent some time with the Boston Tea Party last week. We're going to party like it's 1773. And you see the residents of Boston cheering on the people who are throwing tea overboard, protesting policies where the king is actually trying to do favors for his friends so their business, the East India Company, doesn't go out of business. We don't like it that the American colonies are supposed to bail out the king's friends and their poor financial decisions and their bad business. Well, where we are right now is we're at a point where we're getting close to being ready to do a test on the colonies and the events leading us to the American Revolution. So we're going to in a way, we're kind of working on the essay part of our test. We're going to write a committee of correspondence letter like the Americans did back in the 1770s. They're going to tell another colony about the events of the Boston Massacre, its trial, and the Boston Tea Party. Because we're pretty mad about that in Boston. So we're kind of being the committee of Boston, writing letters to other committees in other colonies to let everybody know what the British are doing. Now, here's how this will work. We have several different parts to what we're doing. Right now, you'll see this says distance learning, but part of these things are good for both distance learning kids and for face-to-face kids. You're going to watch an Edpuzzle video to learn what committees of correspondence do. If you're corresponding with someone, you're writing letters. So they're writing letters to different colonies. And then we're going to actually write a letter. And this will be a good chunk of our test, actually. Our tests we do in American culture don't often do a big, huge test all at one time, other than pretest, but that's its own story. So let me show you some instructions for what we're going to do and show you how you're going to begin working on a rough draft of your committee of correspondence letter. When you click on committee letter instructions, that will lead you to a document that looks like this. And it says a committee of correspondence activity. So it reminds us that committees of correspondence are formed to write letters. Samuel Adams in Boston created the first of these, and before long there are committees everywhere. They even developed like an early kind of a post office system to deliver these letters. So if you are a member of the Boston Committee of Correspondence, you're going to write a letter to a committee of correspondence in another town or colony explaining the events of the Boston Massacre and the trial of Captain Preston, and also the Boston Tea Party can be part of our deal. So some guidelines. You'll start your letter by introducing yourself and your purpose for writing this letter. Of course, the purpose is to get people mad and stirred up and let them know what the British are doing. You're going to tell the story of what's been going on here in Boston, the massacre where 5 Boston residents are killed. Okay, maybe they weren't being as peaceful as we like to think they were. The trial of Captain Preston, where he's found not guilty, and some soldiers are found not guilty of murdering these Boston residents, probably mostly under self-defense, and it probably really was the right outcome. And of course, the Tea Party that we did last week is a big part of the story about what we're upset about in Boston. So you're going to tell people about this stuff, what's going on, use a good explanation, what's happening. You can go back to any of the materials we used last week in class. If you're in face-to-face class, we reenacted the Boston Massacre. Remember some of the things we did. Some of you were the Boston residents who were killed. Some were the British soldiers. You might remember the rope factory fight and the incident in Brattle Street with a soldier poking his sword at some people. And maybe you remember Edward Garrett getting hit in the face with a gun. Somebody was Edward Garrett, the smart mouth punk. Well, and then we ultimately concluded with the massacre. But those things we've done in class are really great things to include in your story. Also, when we did Boston Tea Party, some of you watched video about it or read about it using some primary and secondary sources. Some of you have been able to use some Boston Tea Party fact or fiction, where we looked at some facts about the Boston Tea Party story and some fictions about the Boston Tea Party story. But that's what you're doing in the third part of this. You'll finish by your letter by signing your name to it. Your real name is good enough. Now, I do have an idea here about being a 100-word minimum. Now, this should be pretty easy. If you're describing the events of the massacre, the trial, the Boston Tea Party, you won't have any trouble getting to 100 words, I'm sure. I do want you to remember, correspondence letters are written from the American perspective, and that's what I expect you to do. You're not being British. You're not saying, oh, those rotten Americans, look what they're. No, we are trying to get people stirred up about what the British are doing. Not a lot unlike today's social media, where it seems like we like to stir people up and get people all irritated. So we're writing from the colonist perspective. You don't necessarily have to be fair to the British, although you don't want to get too carried away. You don't want to get too crazy with how you're describing things. Don't go too far beyond the truth, or people won't believe you. You don't want to, have hundreds of people killed by the British, blood running through the streets of Boston. No, that gets a little crazy, and no one will believe you. Similar to today's news, sometimes when things are a little too exaggerated, news organizations start to lose their audience. I think, that's not really true. Now, so there's where we are. Now, let me show you one other document that you'll use that will be very helpful to you. Because we're starting today to work with a rough draft, I would like you to open the Committee of Correspondence letter template. Now, when you open this for you, it'll look a little different till you get to it, but you'll get to a template that you have in Google Classroom. It'll look like this. All right, so we're going to open this template. I can make it a little bigger so you can read it a little better, maybe. There we go. Okay. So these are the things that you are assigned to do in your in the previous page here in the instructions. You're introducing yourself. Tell me who you are, where you live, what colony you're writing from. That's Boston. And why you're writing this letter, to get people all angry about what the British are doing. This next box, you're going to talk to your audience about what's been going on in Boston. You'll notice as you type, the box keeps getting bigger and bigger. So keep it moving there. Keep your story going about the massacre, trial, and Tea Party. They're all part of what we're writing about. This box here, you want to ask that audience to be angry about how they're treating you, join you in resisting. You want to sign your name. And these are, kind of a recreation of what the Americans were really doing in the Boston or in the committees of correspondence. So that's our job for right now. And if you have questions, please email me or contact me if you're not exactly sure what you're doing. The whole idea is that we are going to be the people that we're learning about. We are learning about the people who wrote Committee of Correspondence letters by doing what they did. And that's another step in getting us closer and closer to the American Revolutionary War.